Hello and welcome to Season 6, Episode 9 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. You can follow BirdLife South Africa on social media platforms and feel free to reach out about the webinar series. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. And for those of you on Facebook, you might know that BirdLife South Africa's Facebook page was hacked a while back, but we now have a new page up and running. So please do search for that and like and follow that page. And we have over 170 episodes. This will be our 180th episode recorded and available on YouTube. So if you've missed any of the other ones, you can always catch up on our channel. So please do like and subscribe to receive updates when we post. We aim to keep these webinars free for everyone to learn from and enjoy. So if you do enjoy the series and you can contribute, no matter how small an amount, please do consider donating. You can donate through our website, or you can scan the QR code to take you directly there. Otherwise, you can also EFT BirdLife South Africa directly and use the reference webinars and your name. And we are very grateful to those of you who do continue to support us. We have developed some children's books with the help of some volunteer contributors to raise awareness about the highly threatened white-winged flufftail and its specialized wetland habitat. And we hope that these books will excite South Africa's youth and engage and experience wetlands and birding for themselves. So the first book is called Run Until You Can Fly. And this follows Saro, a critically endangered white-winged flufftail, and his friends Oryx the otter and Gus the crane. And they come across several surprises together that will test the trio's strength and friendship. And the second book is Piffy and Zenzi Go Birding. And these are two poodles, Piffy and Zenzi, and they wonder what birding means. And they go on a day out with their human friends and discover a diversity of birds and other species inhabiting the wetlands. They learn about the special adaptations to living in aquatic habitats and the vital role that wetlands play in our everyday lives. So you can join these two cheeky pups on their birding adventure, a journey that leads to a threatened bird that few have ever seen. And so you can go to our website and get your free copies of these amazing books. So now on to tonight's episode. I'm very pleased to be hosting a webinar about penguins, and particularly the recent litigation that BirdLife South Africa and SANCCOB started, and with the help of the Biodiversity Law Centre. So tonight we are joined by some of the team who were involved in the litigation, and we will be running this as a panel discussion. Alistair will give a brief introductory presentation, and then we'll answer some questions. So I'll just introduce our three panelists. So Dr. Alistair McInnes is a marine ecologist and conservationist, and he's worked in these fields since 1998. He completed his PhD on the foraging ecology of the endangered African penguin at the University of Cape Town's Fitzpatrick Institute, and he is currently the Seabird Conservation Manager at BirdLife South Africa. And then we have Nicky from SANCCOB, and she spent the last 15 years working at SANCCOB, fulfilling various roles. She holds a Bachelor's of Science with honours in Animal Sciences from the University of Plymouth in the UK. And she is currently the head of conservation at SANCCOB and concentrates on the strategic direction for seabird conservation efforts and works closely with other organisations and governmental authorities on appropriate measures to slow the decline of threatened seabirds. And last but not least, Kate Handley is the co-founder and executive director of the Biodiversity Law Centre, and they are a legal non-profit organisation that seeks to use the law to protect and restore indigenous species and ecosystems in southern Africa. And Kate established the centre a couple of years ago in response to the need for a legal non-profit providing this kind of support to other organisations and communities. Before founding the centre, Kate practiced as an attorney at a specialist environmental law firm, Cullinan and Associates. She has a Bachelor of Laws in and a master's degree in environmental law from the University of Cape Town, and a Bachelor of Social Science from Rhodes University. So thank you very much to the three of you for joining us. And I think we will get started with Alistair's presentation.
Thanks, Christina. Good evening, everyone. Just going to share my screen. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining this webinar, and thanks, Christina, for hosting it. Joined by Kate Handley and Nicky Stonder, as Christina has introduced them already. I'm just going to give you a brief background to the processes that led to the recent court settlement, and then go through some of the details of the island closures and how they compare to past closures before I hand back to Christina to open up a discussion with a panel with Kate and Nicky as well. So the long road to settlements. So there's been various processes and lots of scientists, conservationists involved from the early 2000s. The request from the department initially actually came from Dr. Rob Crawford in 2006 to initiate some sort of experimental closure design to assess the impacts of purse seine fishing on the performance of African penguins around some of their major colonies in South Africa. So this was a long process, 14 years since 2008. There were various scientific publications published. There was also lots of controversy around those results, but generally the scientific publications did indicate positive impacts of these closures during the island closure experiment. One of the sort of landmark papers was by Richard Shirley and co. in 2018, which showed significant positive results of these closures. And since then, the NGO and academic sectors have been advocating for implementation of long-term closures around the 6 remaining large African penguin colonies in South Africa. DFFE facilitated a number of stakeholder engagement processes since 2021, and this was to try and find some common ground between the fishery stakeholders, the industrial purse seine fisheries stakeholders, and the conservation sector in finding closures that would maximize benefits for penguins and minimize fishing losses to the industry. Unfortunately, both processes in 2021 and 2022 were unsuccessful in getting agreement on suitable closures, and this left a bit of a void, an impasse between the sectors, which led to the convening of an international panel of fisheries and seabird scientists in 2023 to assess the different merits of different proposals before 2023. The results of this assessment indicated that there was positive benefits of closures to African penguins. It identified the limitations in the island closure experiment in terms of what it could and could not measure. But despite that, it recommended the use of a trade-off mechanism to finalize the actual delineation of these closures. And they recommended that the duration of these closures should align with the life history traits of African penguins, in particular, the age to first breeding, which is 4 to 6 years old, and also survival, and that would be measured by their generation length, which was 10 years. Subsequent to that, the Minister Barbara Creasy announced long-term closures for 10 years with a review after 6, but she deferred the delineation of those closures back to the sectors for negotiation. And by the end of 2023, the impasse that had ensued in 2022 had persisted, and we were left with the default closures, the interim closures of 2022, which neither of the stakeholders were actually happy with. So BirdLife South Africa and SANCCOB took the very difficult decision in 2024 to launch litigation, and this was facilitated by the Biodiversity Law Centre. The litigation was launched in March, and there were various submissions from both the applicants, SANCCOB and BirdLife South Africa, and the respondents, DFFE and the fisheries sector throughout the course of that year. During the same year, unfortunately, African penguins became the first penguin species globally to be downlisted to critically endangered, with a forecasted extinction in just 10 years from now, 2035. So last year was quite a critical year for African penguins. There was originally a court case scheduled for October. This was delayed until March in 2025. And there were various negotiations going on between the sectors in terms of settlement proposals in late 2024 and early 2025. And just a few weeks before the court case in March of this year, a settlement proposal was finally accepted by both sectors and became an order of the court in March. And effectively, this settlement ensured closures around 6 colonies for 10 years with a review after 6. And I'll just go through what the actual closures are. And the closures are currently implemented, are part of the permit conditions for this fishery, and they were implemented just not even a week later after the court order. So these have been in place since late March. So let's just go through what these closures are, in fact, and how they compare to the pre-settlement closures. So we can start with the West Coast. I'll go through region by region. So this is the West Coast with Dasson Island and Robben Island. Dasson Island, historically the biggest population of African penguins. The closure is currently the same as the interim closure. It covers over 90% of the important foraging area, which is the green shaded area. The current closures are those black hatched lines, and the orange lines are the ones that were pre-settlement. So Dasson remains the same. We still, although there is generally good coverage of the important foraging areas, we're still concerned about the area to the north, where we know there is an appreciable amount of fishing effort. For Robben Island, the pre-settlement closure was that little orange square. You can see, which is actually was the existing marine protected area restricted zone. The settlement proposal included a threefold increase in the size of that area to the black hatched 20-kilometer radius around that colony. So a marked improvement for Robben Island. And if we look at Dasson and Robben Island together for this region, there is quite a good coverage of protection for African penguins in this area. If we move to the southwest coast, so that's around Betty's Bay and Gansbaai, before the settlement around Stony Point, there was a very small closure, as you can see in orange. It wasn't very reflective of the important foraging areas, the areas in shaded green that we know penguins go from tracking data. The settlement agreement included a vast improvement to that closure. So we now incorporate most of the important foraging area. Again, as with Robben, more than 3 times more representative than the pre-settlement closure. Dyer Island, we're currently sitting with the same pre-settlement closure. So this is a bit of a novel closure. It's a split zone. So this inshore jagged area is completely restricted to fishing to all vessels. And the area outside of that in the black box is restricted to vessels greater than 26 meters or equal to or greater than 26 meters in length. And the reasoning behind that split closure stems back to negotiations in 2022 between the sectors to alleviate the pressure for the smaller rights holders in Gansbaai, who generally have smaller vessels. And then lastly, in Algoa Bay, the pre-settlement closures are those in orange, and the ones agreed to are those again in the black hatched lines. An improvement in the St. Croix closure, and then also an improvement generally in the Bird Island closure back to the 20-kilometer radius. So generally, if you look at this region as a whole, there is generally good protection for African penguins in addition to the existing marine protected areas in that area as well. If we compare these closures to those previously proposed, so these include those proposed during the stakeholder processes in 2021 and 2022, we can see that Dasson Island remains very similar. Robben Island and Stony Point are vastly improved, significantly improved. Dyer Island remains very similar as well. St. Croix Island has improved, and Bird Island has always had really good coverage. Bird Island is also has the least amount of fishing pressure. So it hasn't really been a contentious closure between the stakeholders from the very beginning. And that's it. I'll hand back to you, Christina, for discussion.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alistair, for that brief overview of the process that's been followed so far. It's good to give everyone a bit of background in case some of our viewers haven't been following the story since the beginning. So we have a few questions that we have put together based on some of the more common questions that we both BirdLife and SANCCOB, or the three organizations, in fact, BLC, SANCCOB, and BirdLife, have received from the public about the settlement. So we'll go through those, but if anyone in the audience does have a question, please feel free to put that in the Q&A box, not the chat feed, but the Q&A box, and we'll get to them once we've gone through the questions for the panelists. And hopefully we will cover a lot of people's questions. So the first question is going to be for Nicky. How happy are you with the closures, and do you think that they are going to benefit the penguins?
Thanks, Christina. I think this is a question that we have been asked quite a lot by people who don't necessarily understand what the closures mean and whether these closures are going to sort of save the species. So absolutely, number one, we are happy that we could secure science-based closures. I think the court order outlining the revised closures couldn't have come at a more crucial time. As Alistair mentioned, the African penguins were uplisted to critically endangered last year, and the prediction is that they could go extinct by 2035. So these closures really could give the penguins a fighting chance. However, they are not the silver bullet, nor have we ever described them as such. So I think it's just important to mention that, given the years where the stakeholders had this deadlock, where there couldn't be agreement reached, the penguin numbers declined severely. From 2018, the numbers were just over 15,000 breeding pairs, and they have now dwindled down to just over 8,000 pairs that we are left with today. So these closures, we are happy with them because they aim to provide the penguins with the much needed protection by removing that competition between industrial fishing pressure when they're foraging for their fish, and in particular during the breeding season when they can't forage sort of long distances. They are limited in their foraging range while caring for their eggs and chicks. So will they help the penguins? We certainly believe so. And by implementing these no-take zones, this should alleviate the negative impacts of resource competition for penguins, and not only penguins, for other species that rely on the fish such as sardine and anchovy as well.
Yeah, thanks. Absolutely, and it's important to use all the tools in our conservation toolbox, and this is one of them. So the next question is for Kate, just going back to kind of the legal process. Can you just walk us through the legal process and what happened in the time between when the court papers filed and when settlement took place, and just kind of outline why the parties chose to settle?
Thanks, Christina, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on the webinar. I think what must be highlighted up front is that the decision to litigate was a really difficult one, and really one taken with much courage by BirdLife and SANCCOB in the face of a ministerial decision that was, as we argued in our court papers, irrational because the minister had appointed an expert panel to advise on what these island closures should look like. And instead of implementing the recommended trade-off mechanism to delineate closures, the closures that remained in place were these so-called interim closures, which weren't representative of penguin core foraging area. So, because the minister effectively didn't follow the recommendations of the panel that she herself had appointed, we argued that the decision was irrational. Also, because it failed to achieve its purpose, which was really to resolve this impasse, which had persisted between the conservation sector and industry for a number of years. The other basis on which we sought to litigate was because the decision, as we argued, was well, the minister had statutory and constitutional obligations to protect this threatened species and prevent extinction, which required the imposition of biologically meaningful closures, but this wasn't done. So the court case in itself was quite novel because firstly, it was the first time in South Africa that these arguments around the constitutional right to have the environment protected and how that translated into penguin conservation were being made. It was also quite unique insofar as it was asking quite robust relief from the court. Not only were we asking for the minister's decision to be reviewed and set aside, but we were in fact asking for the court to step in and substitute the minister's decision for the closures that the applicants put forward as the preferred closures. So the industry parties were obviously cited because of their interest in the matter, but the real challenge was against this ministerial decision. And both parties ended up opposing the application, which was filed on the 20th of March, 2024. And without going too much into the legal nitty-gritty, what generally happens with an application like this is that the record of decision, or all the documents which fed into how the minister made a decision, are then supplied to all the parties, and subsequently affidavits are exchanged between the parties. And the state had delayed in filing the record, which meant there were from the outset delays in proceeding with the litigation. Eventually, we did get allocated a court date of the 22nd of October initially, and the industry parties, of course, filed their answering papers on time in August. But the state, again, there were delays on the state's part, and their papers were only filed in and around September, which meant that the court date of October was no longer possible because there were other papers that needed to be filed. So it was with some frustration that we agreed to the date of the 18th of March for the renewed date for the hearing. But in the interim, obviously, there were negotiations, particularly between industry and the applicants in terms of, just trying to reach a resolution on the matter, because really this is where the impasse had lied. And I think, in litigation like this, once you've seen the arguments, which we thought was strong on our part, but, you get to a point where you've got to weigh up the risk really of protracted litigation in the face of a species which is ultimately facing extinction in the wild by 2035 if nothing is done. And there's always a risk, once the arguments crystallize and you see, what both sides are saying. Litigation it's not necessarily, it can be a blunt instrument, but it's not necessarily a quick fix. And really, there was bona fide negotiations from both the industry and from the conservation sector, and this did culminate in a last-minute settlement, which was also accepted by the state parties and made an order of court on the 18th of March. So this is a bit of a whirlwind tour of the court process, but I'm happy to answer any questions for those who want more detail on the legal nitty-gritty. Christina, you're on mute.
Sorry, let's try again. Thanks, Kate. Yeah, it was quite a very long and complicated process, so thanks for walking us through that. So the next question for Alistair, and Nicky can also come in on this. When do we anticipate that we'll start seeing results of the closures for the penguins, and when will we start seeing impact on the penguin population?
Thanks, Christina. That's quite a difficult question to answer because there's so many factors at play here. But what will happen now and what will be instituted will be a monitoring and evaluation program based on the 6 and 10-year reviews. So the island closure experiment itself was limited because it was 3 years open and closed. So we couldn't measure things like survival and recruitment of first-time breeders back into the population. So if we're going to measure the effects of these now longer-term closures, we need to see how they impact the ability of these birds to recruit and for both immatures and adults to survive. So those timelines are 6 and 10 years. So that'll also depend on a whole bunch of other external factors. So what will the stocks of the fish be like more generally in those years? So if we, get the status quo in terms of what happened in the island closure experiment, we would expect the populations based on forecasts from researchers at the University of Exeter to start improving within 5 years. To turn the tide in terms of a decreasing population to a more positive one, that's likely to take a bit longer. So more like a generation length or longer. So it's difficult to pin that down. The other thing we need to consider are all the other threats that need to be managed as well. And there could be unforeseen threats that we can't anticipate at this time that we need to be vigilant about in order to give these closures the best chance of success. Yeah.
Thanks, Alistair. The next question is linked to that about the monitoring of closures and who's responsible and what does the monitoring look like?
So yeah, I can answer that. So DFFE is ultimately responsible for the monitoring and evaluation program. So they have a Seabird technical team that convenes 2-3 times a year that set out a draft monitoring and evaluation plan over the next years, and which outlines who's responsible for collecting what information. So there will be a lot of the same players that were involved in the island closure experiment. So a lot of the managing authorities. So for islands like Dasson and Stony and Dyer, Cape Nature will play a huge role. For the islands in Algoa Bay, South African National Parks will play a key role. For Robben Island Museum will be involved in that. DFFE will be monitoring the overall population, but then also the NGOs and academia will play a huge role in collecting lots of information on both breeding success, but also foraging performance, the use of weighbridges, for instance. SANCCOB's rangers will be collecting a lot of information. They also have their population monitoring pit tag project as well. So there'll be lots of role players, and it's really important that this is really coordinated well and that we don't have big data gaps by the time we come to the review in 6 years' time.
Yeah, absolutely. Monitoring will be key. So the next question is one that we get quite a lot, and I see it's already being asked a couple of times in the Q&A box, asking about monitoring of the island closures and what happens if there is a failure to comply with the closures. So Kate, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, the department was very quick in actually affecting the court-imposed island closures. Within a week, as Alistair mentioned, the permit conditions had already been amended and the island closures made a part of those permits. Now, in terms of the Marine Living Resources Act, which is the statute that governs fisheries management in South Africa, failure to comply with a condition of a permit is an offence. And it attracts quite a hefty penalty of, if I'm correct, 2 million rands of a fine or 5 years imprisonment for failure to comply. But the benefit of having these closures as part of a court order is that any non-compliance will also be subject to contempt of court proceedings for failure to comply with the court order. And these proceedings can similarly attract penalties of a fine, an imprisonment, or a suspended sentence. So the consequences of non-compliance are in fact quite significant.
Yeah, sounds like it. And we should also just say that compliance has, when the experiment was running, compliance has historically been very good. Well, generally very good, yeah. So then I see this question has also come up in the Q&A box, that there was a criticism of the island closure experiment for only providing a small improvement or a small change to the rate of penguin decline. So is this criticism valid? What response is there to that criticism? Alistair, I think if you can take that one.
Yes, Christina. Yeah. So this has come up a lot over the years, including during the litigation processes. And I suppose one of the most important things is to go back to, I think it was 2015, when there was a task group set up by DFFE Fisheries branch under the Small Pelagic Working Group to oversee the analysis of the experiment results. And at that stage, both the fisheries scientists and the seabird scientists agreed that a 1% improvement in the population growth rates per annum represented a meaningful improvement in the population that should be reflected in terms of management and management interventions. So that was, that is documented before the results of the experiment actually came out, that there was general agreement on this 1% threshold. And the results of the experiment that were finalized during the international panel review showed that the improvement to the population was well within that range. So the 1% also needs to be assessed in the context of the island closure experiment. So the island closure experiment wasn't designed to measure all the potential benefits of closures because of the limitations in the design of the closure itself. So what you had was 3 years open and closed regimes within each pair in those two regions. You also had 20-kilometer closures that weren't necessarily reflective of where the penguins went in some colonies. They were in most of the colonies, but not in all. So they couldn't measure, the design of the closures weren't in place to measure things like immature and adult survival. So those didn't even come into the equation with the 1%. And we know from other species abroad, like black-legged kittiwakes, that have been studied extensively in the UK in terms of the impacts of sand eel fishing. It's also a forage fish, that limiting excessive take of sand eel populations near kittiwake populations has had a significant bearing on the actual survival. So that's something we can only measure now. And if the results reflect of what has been recorded for other species in the world, it's highly likely that those benefits could exceed the 1% that we are able to determine now. Regardless of all of that, the 1% as it stands now is meaningful. So students under Richard Shirley, Jenny Gregg from the University of Exeter has done some forecasts into the future, just using this 1% improvement. And for Robben Island and Stony Point, they've shown a very significant improvement in the population when compared to not having those closures in place as well. So there's definitely enough scientific evidence to demonstrate that these interventions will have a meaningful improvement on the population, but time will tell exactly what magnitude that impact will be.
I'm muted again, sorry. Thanks, Alistair. And yeah, our next question is also, I think, one that you will answer, and then we'll let you rest for a minute. About the Dire Island closure. We've had some concerns from stakeholders in the Gansbaai region about the closure of the the split zone closure with the 26-meter vessel size restriction being a bit of a concern for people, and whether this is going to be sufficient for the penguins. Do you have any comments around that?
I think those concerns from stakeholders are definitely valid, because we have the same concerns. So we don't understand what this vessel limitation will actually achieve in the long run. We know that the majority of vessels are less than 26 meters. So will it actually make any difference at all? We don't know. as I mentioned before, though, that split zone configuration was actually implemented as an idea. Initially, the concept was born out of the need to alleviate pressure for the smaller rights holders in Gansbaai, which is a valid reason, and we're not out to put people out of business. That's not our intention. So if there is some middle road, we've always been open to that, as long as there are ultimately benefits to the penguins. In this case, it's another situation where we need to do further research. So there is currently a master's student, Camille, from the University of Liège in Belgium, that is looking at this specifically to look at the different amounts of fish caught for different vessel size constrictions, to see if this 26-meter vessel restriction is actually meaningful in alleviating catches around the colony. And she'll also look at the tracking data that various people have done off Dyer Island before and after this size restricted zone was implemented in 2022, September 2022, to see if there has been a meaningful improvement. So this is something that's always been very contentious. There is a lot of fishing around Dyer. There's a lot of livelihoods that are associated with that area. So it's a case of, first of all, doing the research, finding out exactly what's going on in terms of that impact, and then working with fisheries more closely to see if there are any alternatives that can be realized in the future, and especially after the six-year review.
Thanks, Alistair. Now, Nicky, on to you for this next question. It's also something we get asked a lot. What are some of the other threats to penguins, and what is being done to combat them?
Thanks, Christina. Unfortunately, African penguins face numerous threats which are complex in nature, and there are different policy documents, such as the African Penguin Biodiversity Management Plan, that is designed to outline the conservation measures to address these threats. And for the most part, a lot of these threats that are facing the species are being dealt with. But there was a severe lack of urgency in dealing with, long-term interventions to curb the major drivers, such as food availability, which is why we ended up litigating. So certainly food availability remains the concern for the species, but there are so many others, such as pollution. That remains an ongoing threat. Certainly decades ago, oil pollution spills were a major threat to the species. That has improved, but it remains an ongoing concern. And what has come to light is that vessel traffic has increased along our coastline, and that's causing severe noise pollution, which the species doesn't seem to be dealing with very well. And specifically, we have been lobbying against ship-to-ship fuel bunkering. This is currently being permitted in Algoa Bay. And since 2016, the high vessel traffic that's being attracted to the bay has generated significant noise pollution, as well as for oil spills, and penguins typically avoid areas with high noise. So the population crash at St. Croix Island for African penguins has been severe, and it directly correlates with the onset of this activity. In our view, African penguins can't tolerate the bunkering in the bay so close to the colony. And then other threats that I can mention, include disease. The highly pathogenic avian influenza has been well documented to affect seabirds globally, and including African penguins. And this remains a concern because it's become the new normal. So making sure that we are prepared for another outbreak is very important. And there's been a lot of work that's been done by the State Veterinary Department, as well as NGOs and indeed government as well. And other threats that are ongoing include predation by marine mammals such as seals and sharks, but the land-based colonies are prone and vulnerable to predation on land as well, such as caracal and leopard, mongoose, and even domestic dog. And then, of course, we have climate change. So the extreme weather events that are taking place are having a detrimental effect on breeding populations. So, extreme heat and storm events are having detrimental effects on nests and can include species or penguins abandoning their nests, which of course leads to failed breeding. So there are numerous, and I don't think I've mentioned them all, but we are trying to tackle all of those with our partners, and the food availability one we were specifically worried about.
Thanks, Nicky. Yeah, we certainly have our work cut out for us. Alistair, did you want to add anything to the threat question?
I think Nicky's covered the major threats really well. Just to add, I suppose that managing these threats are often not mutually exclusive. So, when you get colonies that are down to 1,000 pairs or less, they become increasingly vulnerable to these random events like a disease outbreak or an oil spill or other, spontaneous threats that are difficult to manage because they haven't got the buffer in terms of the size of the population to deal with those impacts. So that's where food availability is crucial because the populations are only, the chance of the population increasing is totally dependent on the availability of prey. So it's crucial that we manage all these things sort of together, but we make sure that the prey availability is available, is well managed for all colonies.
So on that note, the last question from me before we get to some audience questions. What are the next steps to secure adequate food sources for African penguins? So I'll go to each one of you in turn, starting with Nicky.
I think we need to really focus on making sure that the sardine and anchovy fishery is sustainably managed. And that's not just for penguins and marine species, but it's also for the long-term livelihood industry and making sure that we have enough fish stocks for the next however many decades. I think looking at Namibia, we're doing some work in Namibia with the penguins there, and the sardine stocks crashed decades ago in the 60s and 70s and have not recovered. We don't want to follow in those footsteps. So I think we need to make sure that the fishery, the purse seine fishery, is more sustainably managed for everybody, not just for the penguins.
Thanks. Kate?
Thanks, Christina. As the Biodiversity Law Centre, we're really concerned with, how the law can operate as a tool to protect and restore species and ecosystems. And I think certainly from our perspective, we can't speak of securing food without talking about securing habitat. So our principal focus at this point is really on bunkering. We've been investigating the practice for a few years now and advocating for the environmental regulation of bunkering in Algoa Bay, because currently it's only managed by SAMSA and by Transnet, with very little oversight from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. And the Minister has recently released draft bunkering regulations, which in our view, it's great to see the impetus from government to actually take a step forward in terms of how it's regulated. But we have a number of concerns with the regulations, not least of which is that the Minister has other powers under statute that he could be using to prohibit bunkering, particularly in the anchorage areas where an environmental risk assessment has highlighted they are a serious threat to penguins. So this is certainly going to be one of our key focal areas going forward, is habitat, securing the habitat, and hopefully thereby securing fish stocks as well.
Great, thanks, Kate. And Alistair?
I suppose as Kate and Nicky have covered a lot of the crucial things, but one of the more proactive interventions, and Christina, this is your baby. So just a shout out for the new colony at De Hoop, because this is a proactive measure to bring penguins back to areas where there are less threats. So there's less fishing pressure at De Hoop. There's less other threats like marine noise and oil pollution, giving the penguins a fighting chance in areas that have generally more prey available, and also anticipating how things may or may not shift during climate change mediated shifts in the prey populations. So having new colonies in areas all around their distribution, so that if things do shift and change, that there is opportunities for them to breed at other sites like the De Hoop colony, which has been successful to date.
Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, if anyone wants more information, I did a webinar a couple of years ago, so go to our YouTube channel. Great, so that's all our questions that we had kind of thought of that people generally ask us, but there are 25 questions in the Q&A box. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, unfortunately, but a lot of them are repeated, and I think we have answered a couple of them through our discussion now. But I'll just start with one that's been asked by Derek and I think Heather, asking about Boulders Beach and why wasn't that included in the court case. So I don't know if Nicky, if you want to take that one, or Alistair.
Yes, sure. Thank you for the question. Boulders Beach is already a no-take zone to commercial fishing, so that's why it wasn't included in this case. But and that's actually very good that it was already made a no fishing zone. So those birds should have good access to sardine and anchovy during breeding season specifically. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks. Then there's a question that it's just come in, but I'm going to get you to answer it now. Just asking what is bunkering. So perhaps we just, so people can understand what we've been saying. I don't know, Kate or Nicky, or any of you can answer.
Yeah, just briefly, I'll just outline what it is. Basically, it's a practice where vessels do not have to go into port to refuel, and this is a really convenient way of refueling at sea. So a refueling vessel will be stationary in Algoa Bay. This can only be done in very specific sheltered bays where weather conditions are not sort of choppy, etc. It's very common around the world, but it's certainly not good practice to do it right next to a critically endangered penguin colony. And that's our concern. So that's what it is. And vessels can basically pull up. They don't have to pay port fees. They just get refueled while they're on their way to their destination.
Great, thanks, Nicky. There's a question from Mervyn, and I think this is for you, Kate. Can this legal template that we've or legal process that we've followed be used in any other spheres for trying to save endangered birds? For example, the flamingos at Campers Dam or Bortus Lark, or any other species. So Kate, do you see any scope for that?
Thanks, Mervyn. That's a fantastic question, and one we've definitely thought about, because the difficulty with a settlement agreement is the matter isn't ventilated in court. So unfortunately, the arguments that we made are not part of any judgment, and the judge didn't engage with them, which would have given us the opportunity to create a legal precedent based on the arguments that we made. So we don't have that in this instance. But that being said, the way we've crafted the arguments, are broadly around what the state's responsibilities are from a constitutional perspective in terms of protecting threatened species. So hopefully, bearing in mind that this was also quite a specific challenge, insofar as it challenged a specific decision that the minister had made. So insofar as there are other government-made decisions that affect threatened species, we do hope that these arguments can be used and built on going forward. And certainly if we have the opportunity to do so in a different context, we will hopefully take advantage of it. But yeah, it's just one of those things, unfortunately. Well, I mean, settlement was the best outcome in this situation, but it did somewhat rob us of the opportunity to create a precedent that is binding on future conservation action.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Alistair, I think this question will be for you from Faisal about the zone around St. Croix Island, which comparing the pre-settlement with the settlement, saying that it was sort of exactly replicated but shifted further to the east. And Faisal was just wondering about why that was the case.
Yes, it definitely does appear so when you look at them. There is a marginal improvement in terms of the coverage. I think it's up from 50% coverage of the important foraging areas to around 55 to 60% of the important foraging areas. But the shift is also towards more of the areas that the penguins have used in more recent years. And there was a compromise in terms of allowing the fisheries from PE harbour to fish closer to the harbour, because obviously that's less of an expense to the fishermen. So there was definitely a compromise there, but we had to look at the settlement holistically in terms of also providing the per se fishery access to important areas, especially for the smaller rights holders, which include the fishermen out of St. Croix as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. I've lost the question that I was going to ask next. There have been a couple of questions, I think, from Lisa and from Derek, asking about other species that might benefit from the closures. Derek specifically asked about pelagic seabirds, and then Lisa asked about other endangered coastal birds like Cape and bank cormorants. I don't know, either Alistair or Nicky, you both could answer that.
Yeah, I'm happy to
Maybe Alistair, go ahead.
Yeah. So we do expect benefits, especially for Cape cormorants. So Cape cormorants have a similar foraging range during the breeding season around their colonies, also within 20, 30 kilometers. They breed at different times of year, so they're more, early summer breeders, but the closures are in place the whole year. So we do expect benefits for Cape cormorants. So especially at islands like Dasson, Robben, Stony Point and Dyer. So Dyer Island has the biggest current population of Cape cormorants in South Africa, but those other colonies also have substantive populations. There's actually also quite a few breeding on St. Croix at the moment, and also on Stag Island off of Bird Island. But Bird Island doesn't really get a lot of fishing pressure. So Bird Island will certainly be useful in terms of being some sort of control to compare other closures with. But yeah, in terms of Cape gannets, they breed further offshore generally. So the benefits to Cape gannets will probably not be as marked as they are for Cape cormorants, which forage closer to their colonies. And in terms of bank cormorants, they forage mostly on rock lobsters. And they do also feed on other fish, but that won't be impacted by these restrictions, which are specific to small pelagic fish, sardine and anchovy, which are also targeted by Cape cormorants and Cape gannets.
Thanks, Alistair. Then there. A question from Raymond asking, do the fishing exclusion zones protect the fish spawning areas as well as the feeding areas? So perhaps you can just expand on kind of what these closures are actually doing for the fish populations and for the penguins. Maybe Alistair, sorry.
He's the right one, yes.
I can attempt that. So, I mean, the closures, were designed around the important foraging areas for penguins during the breeding season. Although we do know that the areas are also important for penguins after they breed, before and after they molt. So we have tracked birds before and after they molt, and they spend a considerable amount of time also close to the colony. In terms of spawning areas to fish, we do know that there is important spawning grounds for sardine on the southwest coast that some of these closures will cover, but I don't think they'll be extensive enough to make a meaningful difference over those spawning areas. So no, they weren't specifically designed around protection of spawning sardine or anchovy spawning areas.
And it's more to protect or to give the penguins the opportunity to forage on the fish when they are around the islands, to reduce the competition. So I've lost my question. There's so many. I've lost my question again. So another one for Alistair, I think. George Branch, and you touched on it in one of your earlier questions or earlier answers. George Branch says, it seems all the major penguin colonies are now protected by closures. Are there any control areas that will not be protected that will allow a valid comparison between protected and unprotected areas?
Short answer, no, not really. I mean, this is not, it's not following the same process as the island closure experiment, which is a well-controlled experiment with alternating open and closed regimes. Unfortunately, we haven't got the time for African penguins with a forecast extinction in 10 years. But what can be looked at is the relative fishing pressure and the relative protection level of the colonies. So some have better protection than others. So if we look at the West Coast, Dassin versus Robin, we can compare the different levels of fishing pressure against the responses of penguins' performance, whether that's out at sea in terms of their foraging behavior or at their colonies in terms of breeding success and generally more survival of immatures and adults. We can compare closures that have more and less protection and ones that have more and less fishing pressure.
Great, thanks. And George was involved in some of the discussions, I think, back in 2014 around the island closures. So I think we are getting very close to 8 o'clock when we like to wrap up. So I'm just going to ask a couple more questions. The first one being to Nicky from Shashi, asking about plastic pollution and how big of a threat that is, because it is a concern for a lot of other seabirds.
Yes, absolutely. Plastic pollution, we see lots of entanglement in penguins coming into the hospitals. On carcasses that we receive from the colonies, we run a disease surveillance program. So each carcass that's brought into the centre gets a post-mortem evaluation, and the stomach contents are checked for signs of plastic. I don't think there's a great deal of plastic ingestion. More of a problem would be the entanglement, which obviously causes huge problems for diving seabirds. So that's all. Yeah, that's all I can comment on that one.
Yeah, it's not the same level of impact as we see on some of the albatrosses or scavenging species that are physically going out there and eating bits of plastic. Yeah, so I think I will end off with a kind of combined question from Faisal and from Jessica, my colleague at BirdLife, Jessica Wilmot, asking whether there's a public awareness campaign around the threat of extinction by 2025, and also linked to that, what can the public do to help the ongoing conservation efforts? So I don't know who wants to answer that, but maybe if everyone would like to say something, you're welcome. So Kate, you're unmuted, or Nicky?
I was going to say this is definitely one for Nicky, so I'm going to let her take the floor.
I mean, I think we were all involved in the PR work. Certainly PR and campaigning forms, the parallel process to the litigation that we were going through last year. But we all agree that we have to continue. We have to continue pushing the message and raising awareness about the fact that this species could disappear in a very short space of time. So platforms like this are fantastic. I'm looking at the numbers on the screen, and I think at one point it was 270 something people who had joined to listen to this talk or this panel. So in brief, just last year, we did set out with a very robust PR campaign. And the idea was to really just highlight the food availability threat to penguins, because a lot of people that we engage with, even in our field, just simply didn't know. They didn't know what was happening because it's out of sight, out of mind. So it was a very robust campaign. I think we were all exhausted by the time March came around and we got through the settlement. But our work by nature is to raise awareness for these seabirds and to highlight the threats facing them. So I don't think we will be campaigning so much unless bunkering takes a turn, and we might have to ask Kate and the BLC to help us out a bit more with that. But certainly the awareness raising remains a critical part of our work.
Absolutely. Anything more to add from Alistair or Kate? No?
I think Nicky's covered it. Thank you, Christina. Certainly from my side.
Yeah, I think Nicky's covered it well. Thanks, Christina.
Then I think we will start to wrap up. It's now just after 8 o'clock. So also just looking in the chat feed, lots of good comments coming in, and Judy Mann has just reminded us about the Not on Our Watch campaign, which is a great awareness raising campaign and run by a whole consortium of organizations. So if anyone does want more information, go to that website or to any of the organizations represented tonight, BLC, SANCCOB, and BirdLife South Africa. So I think we will leave it there. There's lots of nice emojis coming in. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to Nicky, Kate, and Alistair. Thanks for spending your Tuesday evening with us. And thanks very much to our audience. And we will be back again in 2 weeks' time with a webinar about vultures, another group of very threatened species. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone. And we'll leave it there. Good night.